Sounds True presents Robert Anton Wilson Explains Everything, or Old Bob Exposes His Ignorance, Session 2, General Semantics, Language, Literature, and Reality.
Bob, one of the consistent themes in almost everything you've written is about the use of language, particularly in the sense of general semantics. What is it about this that intrigues you so much?
Well, first I got interested in general semantics, then I got interested in some related fields like metalinguistics. General semantics took Korzybski 900 pages, including a lot of mathematics, to explain what it's all about. Lots of people have written popularizations to make it simpler. I would say part of what it's about, instead of saying what general semantics is all about, part of what it's about is the way the words we use influence our perceptions and therefore our behavior. And metalinguistics, which was founded by Benjamin Lee Whorf, is the science of how different languages create different worldviews. He was an expert in American Indian languages, and one of his most memorable essays was a demonstration that it's easier to discuss Einstein's relativity in Hopi than it is in English. One of Whorf's sentences that I underlined about 30 years ago or 40 was, "A change in language can transform our apprehension of the cosmos." And you can't see that very strongly in the Indo-European group because they all have basically the same structure. But if you learn enough mathematics, you begin to think in a different way than Indo-European. And I was fortunate enough to encounter Ezra Pound and Ernest Fenollosa very early on. Pound thought Victorian poetry was a lot of slush and quality of true poetry. He established two rules for modern poetry. Don't use abstractions. If you want to deal with abstractions, write a philosophical essay, but don't try to pass it off as a poem. And the second rule is, after you get rid of all the abstractions, make the imagery as precise, definite, and clear as possible. And that was the beginning of the Imagist movement. And writing according to his own rules, Pound attracted the attention of the widow of Ernest Fenollosa. Fenollosa was a Harvard graduate who went to Japan and fell in love with Oriental poetry and Oriental painting. And he wrote several books trying to explain Oriental painting and poetry to Westerners. Before Fenollosa, there was a general impression among Western scholars that Chinese and Japanese poetry was primitive and crude. And Fenollosa argued that it was neither primitive nor crude, but very highly sophisticated. And that's why there are haiku all around these days, including computer haiku and movie review haiku and so on. It was Fenollosa who started the whole interest in brevity and precision of imagery in Oriental poetry, especially the haiku form. But in Chinese poetry generally, even in longer verse forms than the haiku, the whole emphasis is on specificity and brilliance of the imagery, clarity of imagery. And I was writing in that style. Mrs. Fenollosa was looking for somebody to complete her husband's translation of a batch of Chinese poems. She read Pound. She decided he was the one. She turned her husband's notebooks over to him. And Pound thereafter embarked on a 40-year campaign of learning the Chinese language and translating most of the Chinese classics. And this led him to give up the term imagism and describe what he was doing as ideogrammic method. Chinese ideograms are not all made up as pictograms, but a certain percentage of them are. Well, Fenollosa had studied with Emerson, and Emerson was one who said every word is a fossilized poem. That's much clearer in Chinese than it is in Indo-European. You look at the word for intelligence, for instance, and it's the sun and moon together.
In Chinese characters.
In Chinese characters. The sun and moon together, so intelligence and brightness are related. My God, we got that in this too. We said a student is bright, and we mean the student is intelligent. It's more clear in the Chinese to look at the sun and moon together, two kinds of things, which I think correspond to the right and left spheres of our brain. Or you take the Tao, which so many people have offered so many different translations of. You look at the ideogram, and it's a sign for intelligence together with a sign for movement. So the basic idea of the Tao is an intelligent movement. Take the Tao Te Ching. My Chinese pronunciation is abominable. It's even worse than my French. But I'm going to make a fool of myself and attempt it because I can't write the ideograms in the air. Ren fa di, di fa tien, tien fa dao, dao fa su ran. Now to take that literally word for word, remember every word in Chinese is both a noun and a verb and an adverb and an adjective depending on where it goes. It doesn't have the subject-predicate structure. But word for word, it's man, model, earth, earth model, universe, universe model, Tao, Tao models self, such. And this is an entirely different way of thinking than you think in Indo-European. I'm not trying to pass myself off as a Chinese scholar or anything like that, but the little bit of Chinese I picked up through Fenollosa and Pound and Alan Watts, who usually has the Chinese ideograms for the key terms, at least in some of his books, and Needham's Science and Civilization in China, in which he has all the scientific terms and philosophical terms from ancient China up through their evolution. China was ahead of the West in science up until the 17th century, and then something happened and the West got ahead. The little I know of math, the little I know of Chinese, and what I've read about American Indian languages by Benjamin Lee Whorf have all reinforced Krzyzewski's original impression upon me that if you use words in a particular way, it will influence the way you perceive the world, or it will influence the way you behave.
When did Krzyzewski's main book come out?
Well, his first book came out in 1919. It was called Manhood of Humanity, and it was based on the theory of time binding, how signals passed across generations tend to accumulate faster and faster. It was about the information explosion, except that word hadn't been coined yet, so he called it time binding. His major work, Science and Sanity, came out in 1933.
And was this widely accepted?
It got a lot of enthusiastic reviews from a lot of distinguished people, and it had a tremendous impact on all of the social sciences for a while. Among the people who praised it, the anthropologist Malinowski, Bertrand Russell, the mathematician, Rolfe, the biologist, quite a few, Poincaré, the mathematician, Fritzman, the physicist. A long and very distinguished list. But then Martin Gardner in the 1940s wrote a book called Fads and Fallacies in the Name of Science, in which he denounced semantics. General semantics still exists. It's taught in lots of colleges. It still is a major influence on the social sciences, but it's not quite as reputable as it was in the 30s.
Didn't he have quite an influence on the beat movement as well?
Well, he had a big influence on William Burroughs. Burroughs studied with Krzyzewski. I studied with Krzyzewski's successors at the Institute of General Semantics. Burroughs studied with Krzyzewski himself. Wow. Burroughs and I, really, that was one of the things we had in common, is that interest in how words influence perception. That's what led Burroughs to his experiments with cut-ups. If you break the lines of word and image, what happens? Do you get free of the patterns in there? Do you create new patterns, or are you still stuck with the same old patterns because you're using the same words? I think all of Burroughs' cut-up experiments are interesting. My favorite is in a book called The Third Mind, and it goes, "Goddamn floating whorehouse, death is the navigator." I have no idea what he cut up to produce those memorable lines, but you got some of the greatest poetry of the 20th century. He may have cut up a porno novel and a news story, or a porno novel and a poem by Dylan Thomas. Burroughs cut up all sorts of things. Burroughs did a short article in one of his books made up of cut-ups of the most devastating critiques written of his works by critics who didn't like his works. He cut them all up and made a word salad out of them. And he says, "I think this is one of the most remarkable pieces of prose I have ever produced, and I say so without any vanity at all, because I didn't contribute a single word. I just did the arrangement." I did the same thing, by the way, in a minor way. In The Earth Will Shake, the comments, when Sigismundo does his first public performance on the harpsichord.
Yeah, and no one can stand it.
Well, some of the audience likes it, most of them can't stand it. All the critical comments are taken out of negative reviews of my own books. Only I cut them up a little and rearranged them so it could apply to music instead of books. I mean, you got to do something with negative criticism. You can either brood about it and get morbid, or try to forget it, or you can make a joke out of it. Joyce, I think, was the first one to realize the value of making a joke out of it. The 7th chapter of Finnegan's Wake, the Shem the Penman chapter, consists, maybe as much as 70% of lines taken from the reviews of Ulysses.
What did you feel was the value?
Norman Mailer would say it was one way of saying fuck you to the reviewers. We all love our own works. Confucius said we naturally love what we see growing up in our own household, talking about parental love. Well, writers feel that way about their books. Our books are like our children. Anybody who attacks our books, it's like they're attacking our children. We're hurt, we're angry, and if you show it, you're acting infantile. So you have a variety of choices. John Steinbeck was notorious for writing nasty letters to unfavorable reviewers. Joyce never replied to any of his reviewers, no matter how nasty they were. He just saved all of them and turned them into high comedy in Finnegan's Wake. I think that's the most constructive use of them. One of the most negative reviews I ever got is on my website. When you click on excerpts from my books, before you get the excerpts, you get this denunciation of me by Robert Schaefer from the Skeptical Inquirer. Quote goes, Wilson describes himself as a guerrilla ontologist, signifying his intent to attack thought and language the way terrorists attack their targets, to leap from the dark for an unprovoked attack, and then slink back to hide behind a hearty belly laugh. The unprovoked attack I especially love. Why unprovoked? Why does he think I wasn't provoked? The reason is because he thinks entirely in cliches. An unprovoked attack is one of those cliches that you hear all the time. You know, if he stopped to think, he'd realize I was very provoked. How about Nietzsche and Wittgenstein? Were their attacks on thought and language provoked or unprovoked?
Well, what would he say?
I don't know what he'd say.
So how much truth is there in his review? Are you seeking to make an attack on people's thought and language?
I don't regard it as an attack. I regard it as an effort at liberating them from their chains.
So rather than a terrorist, as he styles you, you're a freedom fighter.
Well, that's the way I see it, but I can see why he sees me as a terrorist. All dogmatists see me as a terrorist, whether they're fundamentalist materialists like Schaefer or fundamentalist Christians like Jerry Falwell. They all recognize that my zetetic or agnostic position is a profound threat, because more and more of modern science, not only the physical sciences, but the social sciences, and modern philosophy in general, more and more are recognizing that they're not as radical as some of my statements. They all recognize there's a degree of uncertainty in all observation. And if there's a degree of uncertainty in observation, then there's a degree of uncertainty in our inferences that we make from observation. And so anybody who claims to have the complete truth about everything is deliberately contradicting most of the knowledge of the 20th century.
Now, has Korzybski's work interwoven well with scientific discoveries and other fields?
Yeah, I feel that. I just reread Science and Sanity about a year ago for the first time in about 30 years. I read it about 10 or 15 times when I was in my 20s. Then I felt I had digested it well enough I didn't have to go on rereading it. About a year ago, I reread it again, and I was astounded. Nothing Korzybski said in 1933 really needs to be seriously revised in the light of future science. As a matter of fact, most of it makes more sense than it did when he wrote it. The general idea of the organism as a whole and the environment as a whole, I may not use that word, but that appears more and more in all the behavioral and social sciences, including ethology and animal psychology and so on. And his whole emphasis on space-time rather than space and time, keep it from time, that I think is getting more and more generally recognized. So we've got to think in four-dimensional rather than three-dimensional terms, which, that's what underlies that quote from Bucky Fuller I'm so fond of: universe is non-simultaneously apprehended.
Meaning we can never see the whole universe at once.
Yeah, the whole universe at once is a meaningless expression within special and general relativity. So we can say largest part of the universe, within the same inertial system we're in.
So maybe the world is starting to become a place more friendly to general semantics.
Every time I read a book on behavioral science, I see some influence of general semantics. I don't think they've all read Korzybski, but they've all read people who've been influenced by Korzybski. For instance, Gestalt therapy. One of the founders of Gestalt therapy, Frederick Perls, was very heavily influenced by Korzybski, as well as by Wilhelm Reich, by the way. And I think SNL methodology, Garfinkel never mentions Korzybski, but I don't think Garfinkel could have thought of half of his experiments if he hadn't either read Korzybski or somebody who read somebody who read Korzybski.
So, for the benefit of those who don't know much about Korzybski or general semantics, what are the basic ideas that he put forth?
Well, as I say, it took him 900 pages, including a lot of mathematics, so everything I say must be taken as an oversimplification. Three of the major principles he puts in terms of a map, territory, metaphor. The first is the map is not the territory. And at a crude level, if you're dehydrated and about to die of dehydration, no matter how many times I say water, 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 you're still going to go on being thirsty. The word is not the thing. The map is not the territory. Labels, especially pejorative labels. If you keep referring to somebody by a pejorative label, you more and more treat that person as if they were the label. Or you go into a building and they tell you this is the sacristy, so you're not supposed to raise your voice. The word has created a magic aura. It's just like any other building. You walk into another place and you don't know whether it's a junkyard or an art gallery. And somebody tells you this is an art gallery. Oh, then you look at everything as a work of art. If they told you it was a junkyard, you look at everything as a piece of scrap metal.
So the labels that we give objects strongly influence our perception of the object.
Yeah. That's why people who keep saying nigger are not going to listen very closely to any argument for racial equality. The word itself hypnotizes them into dividing the human race into two parts, the real humans and the ones that are only partly human. And that's the way they perceive the world, and that word helps perpetuate that type of perception. The same with all racial epithets.
But as long as we're going to use words to describe things, how can we help but use maps to describe the territory?
Well, we got to use maps. Korzybski's point is we got to realize the map is not the territory. And the second point is the map does not show all the territory. And my favorite illustration of that is a map of Dublin, Ireland, that showed all the territory. It would have to be at least 2,000 years old, because we know that there were people settled around there at least 2,000 years ago. It would have to be 2,000 years old, perpetually changing over the 2,000 years, and including God knows how many million human beings, how many 100 million rats and mice, how many billions of bacteria, how many deer, bear, and other critters that have been driven out by now. All of them moving for 2,000 years. That would be a complete map. And it would be no use whatsoever, because the purpose of a map is to simplify it. I hope you understand. When you include everything you haven't simplified, you don't understand, and all you got is a vast whirling confusion. So the map does not show all the territory, which means no model covers the whole universe. No theory explains everything. And the third, which is the most subtle, is you can make a map of the map and a map of the map of the map, and so on to infinity, which means that as information accumulates, every map can be revised to make a map of the map. As for example, chemistry and physics are two different sciences up until physical chemistry began to appear. Neurology and psychology are more and more being replaced by neuropsychology or psychoneurology. Immunology has blended with two other sciences, and now you see there's actually a journal, I think, called the Journal of Psychoneuroimmunology, which is brain, nervous system, immunological system interactions, which is, I think, where you find the whole explanation of faith healing, Christian Science, spontaneous remission and other medical oddities of that sort, where what people think seems to have an effect on how fast they recover or how well they recover from an illness. And now we've got sciences like ethnomethodology, which is sort of a social science that studies other social sciences. That's definitely a map of the map. And in a sense, Marxism is a map of all previous economics. Marxism analyzes how all previous systems of economics rationalize the interests of some class or other. And Marxism is more true than the others, according to the Marxists, because it rationalizes the class interest of the class that is going to take over the whole world eventually, namely the suffering and crucified workers. It's a variation on the basic Christian myth put into sociological jargon. Freudianism is a map of all previous maps, in the sense you can use Freud to analyze anybody's map to see what neurotic functions they are serving, or what self-defense is. For instance, the Freudian analysis of Marxism would say that Marx must have had a lot of conflicts with his father. He projected as the capitalist as a father figure, and the whole Marxist movement was the need for rebellion of sons against fathers, which oddly enough was suggested by Guillaume Battista Vico in 1735, long before Freud or Marx. Vico said all revolutions are sons against fathers. That's in his book, The New Science, which is the basic structure that Joyce adopted in Finnegan's Wake.
Isn't Vico one of the background characters for Finnegan's Wake?
Yeah, he plays as an important role in Finnegan's Wake as Homer does in Ulysses. Vico is sometimes called a philosopher, but I have seen him referred to as the father of scientific sociology. He thought he was a scientist. His book is called The New Science, and it's an attempt to analyze history in a way that makes sense out of it. He was one of the first to realize the importance of language in creating perception. He came 200 years before Korzybski or Benjamin Lee Whorf or Edward Sapir. By the way, the theory that language influences perception is nowadays generally called the Korzybski-Whorf-Sapir hypothesis, because all three of them published it at approximately the same time. I tend to quote Korzybski more often than Whorf or Sapir, because Korzybski, I think, made a more totally revolutionary system out of that simple basic discovery. And he offered a whole bunch of clues as to how you could reform your language to avoid most of the errors that seem to be built into the Indo-European subject-predicate language structure.
So he not only pointed out a problem, but a solution.
He see a problem and a bunch of tools to help you work to a solution.
What would some of those be?
Well, I've been doing it throughout all these programs, and nobody can see it because these are audios. It's the gesture of waving two fingers in the air. It's putting quotes around a word. That is to remind yourself and remind the people you're talking to that that word has multiple meanings, and there's no general agreement. It hasn't been scientifically and operationally defined, so we may be blundering into metaphysics without even knowing that we're doing so. He put those quotes around all sorts of words, like mind, and whenever he had to refer to space, he'd put quotes around it. He wouldn't put quotes around space-time because he thought that had been scientifically defined. But if he had to refer to space alone, he put quotes around it. And God, he not only put quotes around it, but when he was talking, he spoke the letters out loud, quote, G-O-D, unquote. He thought that was such a dangerous and unscientific term that you had to protect yourself doubly against falling into traps when you started using it. Another of Korzybski's devices is dating. Like, John is grouchy, which is a sentence you might hear any day, anywhere. It carries over the medieval scholastic version of Aristotelianism implicitly, which assumes that John has some kind of demon or essence or metaphysical something inside him called grouchiness. A more operational statement, which Korzybski would prefer, were John seemed grouchy at the office this morning. Now, if you believe John is grouchy is a sensible sentence, and you meet John at the beach, he's got a beer can in his hand and his arm around a beautiful girl, and he's laughing his head off, then you got to conclude John has multiple personality disorder. John is grouchy and John is cheerful. Oh, he's bipolar personality. But if you realize the organism and the environment principle, John may very well be grouchy in the office because it's a miserable place to work. And John may be basically a cheerful person when he's not stuck in the office.
Isn't that the kind of ambiguity that we just learn to deal with?
Well, the thing is, Korzybski's tactics are to help you deal with it and be on guard against these kind of overstatements. As a fascinating example, fascinating to me anyway, the hero of Joyce's Ulysses, Leopold Bloom. Critics referred to Bloom as a Jew from the 1920s up until the 1970s when somebody published an essay in the James Joyce Review called, "Is Leopold Bloom a Jew?" It depends on how you define Jew. According to the rabbinical definition, a Jew is the son of a Jewish mother. Bloom is not Jewish by that definition. He's the son of a Protestant mother. According to the Nazi definition, a Jew is anybody with a known Jewish ancestor. Bloom is a Jew by that definition because his father was Jewish. The third definition is a Jew is somebody who practices the Jewish religion. By that definition, almost every Jew I know is not a Jew. I don't know a single Jew who practices the religion. And Leopold Bloom doesn't practice the religion either. So he's not a Jew by that definition. The fourth definition is somebody who, even though he doesn't practice the religion and doesn't have a Jewish mother, regards himself as Jewish because of ethnic or cultural solidarity. And then there's a fifth category, which is somebody who doesn't generally think of himself as Jewish, but suddenly finds himself identified that way or identifying himself that way, like Dreyfus perhaps when he denounced some of Israel's foreign policies. I don't think he generally thinks of himself as Jewish, but he had to think of himself as Jewish when he was criticizing Israel. How is Leopold Bloom a Jew? The answer turns out by 3 definitions he is, and by 2 definitions he is. And is this trivial? I don't think so. I think Joyce made Bloom's background genetically and culturally so complicated to make anti-Semitism seem even more ridiculous. Because Bloom is only Jewish by some definitions, yet the anti-Semites that Bloom encounters during the long day of Ulysses, they all treat him as if they know what a Jew is and that Bloom fits their definition. Hardly any of them know he doesn't practice the Jewish religion, for instance. As a matter of fact, Bloom is officially a Catholic, although he doesn't practice that religion either, but he converted in order to marry Molly.
So you're saying that the words that we use are often reductive to the point of actually warping the situation?
Yeah, well, I think almost all forms of group prejudice, group bias, group hatred, group violence, I think they're all either caused by or vastly exacerbated by the use of labels with pejorative connotations.
So, how can we protect ourselves against this besides making quotes and using time-based statements?
Well, using the Korzybski system of indexing. Like if you want to generalize about plumbers, the first thing you got to call to mind, according to Korzybski, plumber sub 1 is not plumber sub 2, is not plumber sub 3, is not plumber sub 4. They're all different. They not only have different fingerprints, they have different degrees of competence in the science of plumbing. They have different degrees of honesty. You find lots of cases somebody's been cheated by a plumber and knows it. He's going around for the next 20 years telling everybody, you can't trust those goddamn plumbers, they're all a bunch of thieves. Which is the same logic as one of my first general semantics teachers, a psychologist named Ray Bontrager, pointed out that the classic Tibet line of thought is all Indians always walk Indian file. I know because the one I saw was walking that way.
So the basic idea is that, in a sense, there are no classes.
Yes. That was a big debate in medieval theology between the nominalists and the realists. And my viewpoint definitely depended from the nominalist. Classes exist in the human mind. We create classes in order to understand the universe. But everything in the universe is a unique and distinct individual space-time occurrence. I am not myself from one day to the next. An electron is not itself from one nanosecond to the next.
So how can we effectually speak about anything?
Well, I write books about all sorts of things. The point is you've got to follow certain rules if you want to attain maximum clarity. If you follow these rules, you may not attain maximum clarity, but you'll attain greater clarity than usual, and Robert Schaefer will denounce you as a terrorist, launching a ruthless attack on thought and language.
So what are some more of the rules? How can we make our language more accurate?
Well, an application of Krzyzewski that a lot of psychiatrists use, especially clinical psychology, especially in rational emotional therapy, but it's infiltrated several other schools of therapy. Let's say you hate somebody who did some terrible wrong to you. Let's say, to take a very topical subject, you were the victim of incest. So you hate your father. The rational emotive therapy approach to that and the Krzyzewskian approach would be first date and index it, because at this point, by the time you're an adult, you probably hate all fathers. So the first thing is you don't know all fathers. How many fathers have you known? How many fathers do you know have committed incest? Limit it to the one who hurt you. Okay, you hate him. When do you hate him? Do you hate him when he did it, or do you still hate him now? And do you know if he's still committing incest, or has he been cured or something? The thing is to specify, isolate, and clarify what you hate. And then the thing is, well, what good does it do hating anyway? What are you going to do about it? You're going to make a decision rather than just going around hating all the time. You either bring him to trial, or you forgive him possibly, I don't know. That's very unfashionable. That's an old-fashioned Buddhist idea, which is not in keeping with political correctness. I guess you should bring the bastard to trial. But whatever the case may be, the thing is to isolate it. Like, this is a wild guess. I think Adolf Hitler, when he was trying to make a living as a painter, he lost a couple of good commissions to a Jewish painter. And Hitler decided the Jews are getting ahead because they're underhanded and tricky, because I know I'm a better painter than he was. Now, if he had dated in an index that he would say, this one guy sold a painting to a client I was helping to sell a painting to. Instead, he generalized about all the Jews in the whole goddamn world. How many of them had he ever actually met? Well, you know, everybody knows Hitler was crazy, but from the point of view of general semantics, he was talking about millions and millions of people he never met, never looked at, never shook hands with, never looked in the eye, and he thought he knew all about all these people. The only case I can think of equal insanity is some of the feminists who talk that way about all men when they've only known at most maybe 120 men out of 2.5 billion on the earth right now.
Certainly a higher number than the number of Jews.
Yeah, so you might say the androphobes are even crazier than the anti-Semites, but they're generalizing about an even bigger group they know even less about.
Isn't this one of the facets of intelligence, though, and science even, is to be able to generalize about things so that we can fit our model to more than individual objects?
Yeah, of course, but the thing is we've got to learn how to generalize scientifically rather than recklessly or unscientifically or superstitiously. It's like Mark Twain, in an argument with an anti-Semite, said anti-Semitism reminds me of a stupid cat I once owned that sat on a hot stove and never sat on a hot stove again. And the anti-Semite says, what's stupid about that? And Twain said, the cat never sat on a coal stove either. So you got to learn how to make generalizations, which involves dating and indexing. And another important part of general semantics comes out of operationalism in physics, and is closely related to John Dewey's instrumentalism, which is you should specify how you made the observation, which is part of the observation according to quantum mechanics. Like the electron appears as a wave when observed with this set of apparatus. The electron appears as a particle when observed with this set of apparatus. You don't say the electron is a wave or the electron is a particle. You just say it appears as when observed with this kind of apparatus. And then you come to the things that people are in perpetual ideological furor about, like, is the fetus human or not? Well, according to operationalism, you can't even ask that question. According to the operationalist attitude of modern physics, the only question you can ask is, what benefits of clarity accrue from considering the fetus human? What benefits of clarity accrue from considering the fetus not yet human?
So the idea is that there's no such thing as it being one or the other. It's just...
Here we come to the basic issue, the question of being. One of Korzybski's most radical suggestions consisted of dropping the word is from the English language entirely. English without is, which is called E prime.
He named it E prime?
No, that was a name invented by David Borland, one of Korzybski's students. I have written 2 books in E prime, maybe 3, I'm not sure, 2.5. And one is an anthology. My contributions are all in E prime. The other contributors wrote as they please. So I've written 2 books entirely in E prime. I've written a lot of other things in E prime, including a couple of movie reviews. I'm surprised how well E prime serves writing movie reviews.
Can you give us a verbal example of how E prime would compare to a normal English sentence?
Garlic smells awful. And that doesn't have the is of identity in it, but it's an absolutist statement. A more operational statement is garlic smells awful to me. Because there are some people who like the smell of garlic.
So you're being clear that it's your personal observation.
Yeah, and like this is a point. Okay, well let's not say this is. Let's take a time. Behind the Green Door is a pornographic movie. That's a statement in ordinary English. In E prime it would come out. Behind the Green Door seems like a pornographic movie to me, which is, qualifies as a scientifically valid statement unless you're lying about it to prove it, to win an argument or some trick like that. But to say it is pornographic is to imply that there's an essence of pornography in it, like the essence of Jesus Christ in the host when the cannibals have their feast every Sunday. There is no such thing as an essence of pornography, scientifically speaking, until somebody invents what I call a smutometer. And you point this at a movie or a book and it tells you how many micro chambers or micro Lovelaces of smut it has in it. You get a direct. Until you have that kind of measurement, people are just talking about their own nervous systems and thinking they're talking about the external world.
But they're not making it clear because they're using the ears.
They don't realize that when they say it is a pornographic movie, they're confusing their own evaluations of what's out there. All you can say about what's out there is that the best scientific model suggests it's photons bouncing off a cloth.
How far are we required to take this in order to get the kind of clarity we're looking for? I mean, for example, you used an example where you said the photon appears as a wave when I measure it with a certain apparatus. But you could take it even further and say the photon appeared as a wave when I measured it with what I thought was this apparatus. You know, and go into sort of an infinite regress.
Well, yeah, Schrödinger created what's called the Schrödinger's cat problem, which goes as follows. You take a cat, you put it in a box, you put a poison gas pellet in there, and you put a radioactive element which will emit a certain amount of radiation statistically over a certain period of time. Then you close the door. You sit down, you write the equations out and solve the equations for any given time, let's say 15 minutes. And you find you get a minimum of 2 solutions. Enough radiation has been discharged to blow up the poison gas pellet, and enough hasn't been discharged yet. You always get a minimum of 2 answers. So until you open the door, the poison gas pellet has and has not exploded, and the cat is and is not dead. Once you open the door, the state vector collapses and the cat's either dead or alive. Now, Schrödinger invented that because, although he was one of the major creators of quantum mechanics, he was very uncomfortable with its philosophical implications. And he said, until we can answer that question, we don't know what the hell we're talking about in quantum mechanics at all. What, does it make sense to say the cat isn't dead or alive until we open the door? And if it doesn't, why do we use equations that imply that we can't say so until we do open the door? And since physicists have been arguing about that since 1935, when Schrödinger first published it in Der Naturwissenschaft, volume 23. It thrilled me when I found out what the number of the issue where he published that. They've been arguing about that ever since. Meanwhile, one of my books is called Schrödinger's Cat, one of the best popularizations of quantum mechanics by John Gribbin, the physics editor of New Scientist, is called In Search of Schrodinger's Cat. It really does highlight the major problem in quantum mechanics. Meanwhile, Wigner made it even worse by pointing out that after you open the door, the state vector is only collapsed for you. For another physicist in the hall outside the laboratory, the state vector doesn't collapse until you open the door and say, dead cat, cat's still alive. Or if you consider a physicist on a computer in London, I'm assuming we're doing the experiment here in California, the state vector doesn't collapse until the email signal arrives in London. So Wigner from this concludes that we can't separate the observer from the observation in any sense whatsoever, and every observer creates a separate universe, or has to be considered as having created a separate universe, depending on which signals they've apprehended at this point, which makes sense in terms of Buckminster Fuller's definition of universe as non-simultaneously apprehended.
So in a sense, each person is carrying around their own universe.
Yeah, in a very real sense. And to repeat myself, I have done experiments hundreds of times in which I have audiences try to describe the same thing, and they all perceive it. And then I have them describe the hall outside the seminar room or the sounds they hear during a quiet period. I have done experiments where they, after they listen to the sounds, and they all discover a very different sound. Yes, how long did that listening experiment last? I get estimates running from 15 seconds to 4 minutes. So we share our own time, too, which is what William Burroughs discovered in Tangier. One day he got up, had some coffee, made a little breakfast, wrote a letter, went down to American Express, mailed it, stopped at a cafe, had coffee with a friend, and it was late afternoon. So where did the whole day go to? We decided the short time mob had moved in. The short time mob are extraterrestrial invaders who steal our time when you're not paying attention. If you're paying attention, they can't steal your time. But if you're not paying attention, they steal a few minutes here, a few seconds there, half hour here. Pretty soon with the whole day gone, you don't know what happened. The short time mob has stolen your time. So the cure is attention, which Aldous Huxley also agreed with in his novel Ireland. The enlightened ruler of this utopian island has released minor birds that fly all over the island and keep shouting, attention, 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 just so everybody doesn't lose their time and drift off.
I guess the essence of my question was, can't we get almost absurd with the level of indeterminacy we would be putting into our language? How far do you feel we really need to adjust how we're speaking in order to bypass a lot of problems?
I discovered that when I talk about uncertainty, people assume that means total uncertainty, and you can't be sure of anything. That's because of the domination of Aristotelian either-or language, true or false. If a thing isn't true or false, then you're totally lost. If you're stuck in the Aristotelian game rules. But we've got several logic based on probability theory, invented by a mathematician named Wolofsky in the 1920s. The guy who invented fuzzy logic in the 1970s, Zadoff. And von Neumann suggested without probabilities, he just suggested a three-valued logic, true, false, and maybe. I have my own adaptation of Korzybski's infinite valued logic. Korzybski calls it infinite valued because he meant you could extend it to as many decimal points as you needed to solve a given problem. So it depends on what you're dealing with. But 1 to 10 is a good enough scale, and oddly enough, Arthur Clarke came to this opinion about the same time as me. He had a show, maybe it's still on some channel I don't get. He had a show called Mysterious Universe, in which he dealt with fringe science, scientists who get results that are rejected by the majority of the scientific community. Are they all crackpots, or does some of them have something? And he never gave a yes or no answer on anything. He'd give a probability from 1 to 10, just like I did. You're not stuck in a void. You can make pretty good estimates. I know the sun does not come up literally, but since I don't want to be too finicky, let's just say the sun is going to come up tomorrow morning as a statement. Actually, it means the earth is going to continue to evolve in the way that the sun will appear to come up in the morning. But anyway, I would set the probability of that at around 9.999 at least. If you want to go to 10 decimal places, I'll add a few more than 9.
So, besides the writing of William Burroughs, where have the ideas of Korzybski found their way into literature?
I suppose there must be some influence on Ginsberg because he was so heavily influenced by Burroughs. To me, though, the equivalent of Korzybski in literature is Joyce's Ulysses, which has lots of is's in it, and because the narrative voice keeps changing throughout the book, you gradually begin to realize you can't trust any one reality tunnel. Everybody is perceiving a different day in Dublin on that particular day. That day when, as Edna O'Brien wrote, nothing and everything is happening.
Now, you hold a particular reverence almost for Joyce, it seems. What is it about Joyce that you find so fascinating?
Oh, there are many, many things, but I suppose the principal thing that comes to mind is inexhaustibility. If I like a book a lot, I tend to read it a second time and sometimes a third time. Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, I never stop reading. I'm continually rereading them or picking them up and reading a couple of pages or reading a chapter. I got Ulysses on videotape. There was a 30-hour reading done by some of the best actors in Ireland on RTV in 1982. And I recorded it on videotape so you don't have to change the tape so often. You can get 6 hours on a videotape. And I got the whole 30 hours. Every now and then I play some of that. Instead of reading the text, I just lie back and listen to the music of the words.
Is that an unabridged?
Yeah, it's a total, they read the whole goddamn text from stately plump Buck Mulligan right up to yes, I will, yes. The whole damn text. And they had some fantastic actors. Best actors in Ireland. And they all changed their intonations as the styles changed, too.
So it's his inexhaustibility in the sense that he creates a world?
Yeah, we'll talk about Finnegan's Wake later maybe, but that one day in Dublin, June 16th, 1904, everything is happening. It's a very ordinary day, to quote Edna O'Brien again, a day when nothing and everything is happening. But in that day, Bloom goes to a funeral, and he goes to a maternity hospital to visit a woman friend who's in labor. So you have birth and death. He visits a whorehouse, and he visits a church. He visits a newspaper office where they're all quoting outstandingly hilarious examples of pompous political speeches. And he passes through the library where they're all discussing Shakespeare. Everything is going on at once in Ulysses, every aspect of human life. Bloom defecates in chapter 4, masturbates in chapter 12, and urinates in chapter 17. You know, everything that happens in an ordinary day.
And according to Joyce's own descriptions, what was he trying to do with this text?
Well, Joyce was not much given to explaining himself. He dropped hints. It seems to me one of Joyce's major motives consisted of trying to push realism to the point where it refutes itself. He'd read and been very heavily influenced by a lot of naturalistic writers, Zola, Thomas Hardy, and especially the plays of Henry Ibsen. Ibsen, of course, gradually moved from naturalism to expressionism as his career went on. But Joyce felt that if he pushed realism far enough, it would collapse upon itself. The closest you can get to realism, it seems, in literature, is the style Joyce uses in most of Ulysses, which is the interior monologue. You're inside one person's head and you're perceiving the world as that person perceives it. Then you jump to somebody else's head, the style changes, and you're perceiving the same day from an entirely different perspective. So the closer you get to realism, the more you realize there is no reality. There are realities, plural, or reality tunnels, to quote Timothy Leary. Leary, by the way, said Joyce's prose prepared, to quote, give the exact words, Joyce's prose prepared me to enter psychedelic space. I would say that Joyce is best read while you're stoned, and if you've never had a psychedelic, reading Joyce is the next best equivalent. Yositani Roshi, with whom I studied Zen briefly, I don't mean to claim I got very far with it, but I studied briefly with Yositani Roshi. He said once, there's nothing special about Satori. You do it every night in your sleep. Zen is just a trick for doing it while you're awake. Well, you might say Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake are two other tricks for doing it while you're awake.
Doing what?
Achieving full recognition of the difference between the map and the territory, or between your subjective evaluations, which you can be sure of, they're since your own, and the objective reality, which you can never be sure of. All you can know is your own subjective interpretations of objective reality. You can only know the map. You can never fully know the territory. Besides, the territory is changing all the time. Universe is none simultaneously apprehended.
Now, is Joyce denounced as a terrorist?
Well, as a matter of fact, frequently he was, yes. A lot of the first criticisms of Ulysses were denouncing it for its obscenity and blasphemy, which was just Joyce being naturalistic. This is the way people talk, these are the things people do, and so on. And if the fiction has never dared face up to it before, well, if you want realism, I'll give you realism, until it collapses on itself, as I said. One recent article defined Joyce as a one-man literary IRA. In a sense, Ulysses destroys English literature, because the whole history of English literature is parodied in one part of Ulysses or another. T.S. Eliot said Ulysses demonstrates the futility of all styles. No matter what style you write in, you're not conveying reality, you're conveying a style. And so Joyce does parodies of Maud Arthur, Dickens, Swift. The whole history of English literature is in Ulysses. And every framework changes where you see the events of that one day in Dublin. You can always find clues as to the objective reality behind all these reality tones, and you can never fully define it. For instance, Bloom is carrying on a romantic correspondence with an unknown woman. He signs himself Henry Flower, and it's quite obvious he doesn't intend to meet this woman ever. He doesn't want to have a sexual affair. He likes to play with the game of pretending he's going to meet her and have an affair, and he's leading her on, but he's too timid to actually do anything as outrageous as commit adultery in Dublin in 1904. His wife is a little ballsier than he is in that respect. But readers for a long time assumed that the woman's name, Martha Clifford, was her real name. And then somebody raised the question, if Bloom is using a false name, could she be using a false name too? So there's been a big hunt among the female characters in Ulysses to pick out the most likely suspect to be the one that Bloom is corresponding with. The current leading contender is Nurse Cahill, whom he meets in the maternity hospital, which makes that whole meeting absolutely hilarious. You think she's the one he's been corresponding. Neither one of them knows that the other is the one they've been corresponding. And that's very typical of the kind of humor that appears throughout Ulysses, mixed in with all the tragedy. Bloom's day is overcast by the funeral in the morning, which reminds him of his father's suicide, and of the fact that his son died at only 11 days old. And so although Bloom is a basically cheerful person, there's an undertone of grief that keeps surfacing, and he always cheers up again. And if it isn't Nurse Cahill, it could be Blazes Boylan's secretary, whose first name is Martha, which makes for a very intriguing pattern, because as one Joyce scholar discovered in the Wandering Locks chapter, when Boylan calls his secretary Martha, she heard on the map of Dublin, the phone calls, and she's got a straight line between where she is and where Boylan is. It passes right through the butt of Grafton Street where Bloom is standing at that time in the department store window. That is so much Joycean that I still suspect it's Boylan's secretary. But here's another strange loop, because Boylan is having a real affair with Bloom's wife, and Bloom is having a pretend affair with Boylan's secretary. It is another example of Joyce's general study of sexual nuttiness in Ireland. And there are dozens of unsolved problems like that, like the man in the brown Macintosh who shows up at Paddy Dingham's funeral. What makes this particularly intriguing is that Bloom seems to know almost everybody in Dublin. Bloom has had a variety of occupations, and Dublin was still a pretty small town in 1904. Yet he doesn't recognize the man in the brown Macintosh. So the man in the brown Macintosh can't be any of the important characters in the novel, all of whom Bloom knows. And yet the man in the brown Macintosh keeps reappearing. He darts across the street before the royal procession in the Wandering Rocks chapter. He shows up in the Cyclops chapter briefly. And when Bloom arrives at the whorehouse at midnight, the man in the brown Macintosh is just exiting. And you never find out who he is or what his connection with Bloom is or what this series of coincidences mean. And there's been a lot of very ingenious interpretations of that, but I think its major function was to serve Joyce's message that the map is not the territory. He didn't read Koszybski, but he worked that out for himself. You can never know all about a single day or a single person. The man in the brown Macintosh may be Bloom's lost uncle, or he may have no connection with Bloom whatsoever. There are things you never will find out. That's the way the world seems to me, so I think Ulysses is closer to the world than any other novel before Ulysses.
Is there any indication that Joyce had studied, for example, the physics of the day? And
Yeah. In his notes for the Ithaca chapter, it's quite clear that he is trying to write the chapter so that it fits Euclidean, Lobachevsky, and Gaussian geometry. The first sentence of the chapter, what parallel course did Bloom and Stephen follow? And that's from the cabman shelter to Eccles Street. I abbreviated the question. So it turns out that you work your way through the chapter that there are analogies with Euclidean, Lobachevsky, and Riemannian geometry. So in one sense, the two parallels, Bloom and Stephen, never meet. They're like in Euclidean geometry. In another sense, like in Lobachevskian, they meet. In another sense, like Lobachevskian, they get further and further apart. And Joyce did that because he didn't want the reader to be quite sure what the climax of the novel was. We never know the climax of the novel. All we know for sure is Bloom is going to get breakfast in bed tomorrow morning. We know that. We don't know what happens to Stephen after he leaves Bloom. Bloom invites him to spend the night, and Stephen politely, courteously, but firmly declines and wanders off at 3 in the morning. Where does he go? He made up his mind. He wasn't going back to the Martello Tower where Buck Mulligan is staying. He's not going to go back to his father's house where the kids are living in miserable poverty because the old man is taking up all the money. Where is he going to go? We never find out. Stephen just wanders out of the novel and disappears entirely. Maybe someday somebody will find the clue that reveals where Stephen went. I prefer to think he wandered past Finn's Hotel and met a housemaid from Galway named Nora.
Joyce's mistress.
Nora Barnacle, yeah.
How much of Ulysses actually revolves around Joyce's mistress?
Well, a lot of people thought Nora Barnacle was the major model for Molly Bloom. When somebody asked Nora about that, she said, surely not, she's fatter than I am. Molly Bloom's language derives a great deal from Nora, and biography derives from God knows what. Writers will frequently take 20 people they've known and 2 characters from novels they've liked in the process of creating a new character. You don't even know where your characters come from.
But isn't June 16th an important day in both the novel and in Joyce's life with Nora?
Yes. This is something a lot of Joyce scholars skirt around nervously. They say June 16th was the day Joyce and Nora went for a walk together for the first time. Actually, as Joyce's letters to Nora in 1909, when she was still in Trieste and he went back to Dublin temporarily to open a movie theater, which he thought would make him rich. And he got cheated by his partners. June 16th, what actually happened is they walked on Sandymount Strand and Joyce made sexual advances and she gave him a hand job. So every year as Bloom's Day gets bigger and bigger and leads to more and more tourist trade and enriches pious Catholic Ireland more and more, they are all celebrating a hand job, whether they know it or not. I think the hand job was so important to Joyce because based on all the biographical work that's been published so far, it was the first time in his whole life that he had an orgasm with a woman without paying for it. And his whole sex life up until then had been entirely with prostitutes. Suddenly here was a woman who, out of sheer kindness and love, was willing to give him what he needed, an orgasm, a relief from sexual tension, whatever you want to call it. He fell in love with her and he stayed in love with her for the rest of his life.
Hadn't he actually had quite a bit of experience in whorehouses?
He started at the age of 14, And he was 22 when he met Nora. So I would say he had experience with quite a few prostitutes.
And June 16th is also the day that's covered in Ulysses.
Yes. He also arranged that those letters to Nora about their sex life, when they were separated, they wrote letters back and forth about their sex life to keep each other erotically aroused until they could meet again. And they wrote to each other about everything they did, everything they fantasized, and so on. And I think Joyce arranged that those letters couldn't be published until 25 years after his death, or 50 years after his death, I forget which. He knew he was a classic. He never doubted it for a moment. Joyce was absolutely 100% sure he was the most important writer since Shakespeare. And he knew he was creating a whole new literature. He'd be the subject of endless PhD dissertations and so on. And he arranged that it would be long after he and Nora were both dead and gone, and Bloomsday would be established as a national holiday virtually before the Irish found out they were celebrating it.
Who were some of Joyce's associates that were working on other important art during this time?
Well, the major one, as far as I'm concerned, would be Ezra Pound. Joyce was living in poverty in Trieste, teaching at the Berlitz School. He had written Dubliners, and nobody would publish it. He had written 1,000 pages of what became the portrait of the artist as a young man. He had made exactly £0 pounds, 0 shillings, 0 pence from his writing in 10 years. Pound was editing an anthology called The Imagists, which were poets who agreed with Pound's ideas about precision of imagery and avoiding abstractions. He asked Yeats if he knew of any poets who didn't belong to that circle but were writing in more or less the Imagist style. And Yeats recommended James Joyce. Pound wrote to Joyce. Joyce sent him a batch of poems. Pound put 2 of them into the anthology. The 2 I would have picked, curiously enough. And then Pound wrote back to Joyce and said, "Send me more poetry." And Joyce wrote back, "I'm not writing poetry lately. I'm writing short stories." He sent Pound the Dubliners stories. Pound went off into one of his fits of enthusiasm and didn't rest until he found a publisher for it. It had been rejected by every publisher in London, Ireland, and the United Kingdom. Pound found a publisher in New York. And then Joyce started Ulysses, and Pound got that serialized in a magazine called The New Free Woman, later changed his title to The Egotist. It was edited by Harriet Shaw Weaver, who was an anarchist, a feminist, and a Stirnerite egotist and an Emersonian transcendentalist all at once. She started serializing the portrait of the artist, and she was publishing a lot of Pound and T.S. Eliot and Benjamin Tucker, the individualist anarchist, who's been a major influence on my thinking. Eventually she decided, when Joyce started Ulysses, that he should not have to undergo the hassles of trying to write such a complicated book while teaching half a day at the Berlitz School. So she sent him a monthly check so that he could quit teaching and devote full-time to Ulysses. A few years later, she began supporting him entirely all through the writing of Finnegan's Wake. And to Joyce, none of this made any sense. Why should Ezra Pound, a man he never met, appear out of nowhere like a fairy godmother and work all these miracles to advance his career? But Joyce finally found the explanation. Pound's father was named Homer. I mean, Joyce's mind worked that way. He was always seeing synchronicities and meaningful correspondences, you know.
Why was Pound so intrigued by Joyce?
Well, Pound had a tremendous capacity for enthusiasm for original work. Pound discovered T.S. Eliot and Ernest Hemingway and quite a few others, as well as Joyce. Joyce was one of his major enthusiasms, but T.S. Eliot was a major enthusiasm too. Pound edited The Wasteland at Eliot's suggestion to make it even more modernistic than Eliot's first draft, and kept writing reviews of Eliot's poetry all over the place, trying to attract more attention to Eliot. When Ulysses came out, Pound wrote 5 reviews of that for different magazines, including one in French for a leading French literary magazine. Pound had a lot of generosity and a lot of revolutionary fervor. He wanted to change the structure of Western literature, and everybody seemed to him to be doing something original and important. He devoted tremendous energies to promoting them. Pound also publicized Robert Frost. In the 1930s, in a letter, Pound mentioned a review which was praising Robert Frost as a poet writing in the Native American tradition, distinguished from Ezra Pound, who's writing as a European, and putting Pound down. And Pound said, the funny thing was that I knew from the day I started promoting Frost that eventually somebody would use Frost as a club to hit me over the head. Well, next to Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, I think Pound's Cantos has more excitement and information than any other 20th century literary work. Cantos invented modern poetry, you might almost say. Let's say Pound and Eliot and a few others were writing modern poetry before the Cantos. But the Cantos went in so many radical and new directions that poetry has never been the same. You can tell the difference between a pre-Pound poem and a post-Pound poem almost as easily as you can tell the difference between Renaissance music and 19th century music. Pound was a major influence on American and European poetry from the teens of this century on. In the 1930s, he became a hero to a lot of young Japanese poets, and his cult has grown and grown in Japan. There's a whole magazine in Japanese devoted to Pound studies. And now he's becoming a major influence on Latin American poetry, too.
So is it just his wide-ranging influence that interests you?
No, I was just pointing out that he wanted to make a revolution, and he succeeded. What fascinates me about Pound, several things. First of all, I find the Cantos the funniest of all the great epic poems, and in most respects the most beautiful, although parts of it don't look beautiful. Parts of it look pretty dull, actually, until you see how they function in the structure of the whole. And rhythmically, the Cantos are more of a delight to read out loud than just about any poetry in English. And the contents fascinate me. The Cantos seems to me the first multicultural poem. Pound was even more cryptic than Joyce in explaining what he was doing, but he did call it the tale of the tribe. And when you look at it, you find the tribe is all of humanity. The poem has as much Chinese history as European or American. It's got African references and ancient Sumerian references. It's an attempt to write a global epic, and it's the first attempt. And I think it's going to be much more important in the 21st century than it has been in the 20th, because I see the 21st century as the time when East and West will more and more merge. For the intelligentsia of East and West, it'll be a great Rosetta Stone by which the Orient can understand the Occident better, and the Occident can understand the Orient better. This is not accurate, but roughly the first third is Occidental, the middle third is Oriental, and the last third is cross-cutting between them to show similarities as well as differences. Like in the closing 30 or so cantos, you frequently get quotes from classical authors in Latin or Greek or Old French or Old English or whatnot with Chinese ideograms in the margin. And this is where Pound wants you to see a connection between an Occidental and an Oriental concept. And he also wants you to see the differences as well as the similarities. I find it about as inexhaustible as Ulysses or Finnegan's Wake. I've been reading the Cantos for 50 years now, and I haven't gotten bored yet. I'm still finding new delights.
Do you feel that Pound and Joyce fed each other artistically?
Well, Pound fed Joyce financially for a while. I mean, he helped Joyce. Their influence on each other remains somewhat problematical. I think they were going in different directions, although they were both trying to get away from what they both regarded as the hypocrisy and pomposity of the Victorian period into something nitty-gritty and down to earth. But Joyce was much more preoccupied with human psychology, although its interest was far beyond that. But if you can find one sentence in Joyce, you might say the study of guilt and remorse and shame and how it affects human beings. because those are the main topics you notice when you start studying psychology and language. It's once you make 99 out of 100 sex acts and things, you got a population everywhere. Everybody feels guilty and is afraid they're going to get caught sooner or later. And that's one of Joyce's major themes. And he projected outward onto the whole of human history, seeing how in different forms it has infected almost all human cultures. Ireland is just one weird special case of that. Pound's interest more and more moved to economics. Pound and Joyce use a lot of the same anthropological sources. And the Cantos begins with Odysseus traveling to the underworld to consult with Tiresias. So there's a slight parallel with the Odyssey, just like there is in Ulysses. There are many parallels and there are many differences. Pound admired everything Joyce did extravagantly up until Finnegan's Wake, which he couldn't stand.
Why?
Well, that's one of those riddles of human life. Pound had a vast appreciation of creative, original work, but Finnegan's Wake was too creative and original in ways that Pound didn't like.
Did he feel Joyce had just departed too far?
Well, when Finnegan's Wake was being serialized in Transition magazine, it was under the working title, Work in Progress, and Pound in his letters refers to it as Joyce in Regress. I think Pound looked at a few samples of Finnegan's Wake as they were published, tried to figure out what the hell Joyce was doing, and discovered that a great deal of it was scatological and childish level excretory and urinary puns, and I don't think Pound deciphered much more than that. He thought Joyce was exploring the murkier areas of the Freudian unconscious, and the hell with that stuff, it's not that important. Finnegan's Wake is a lot on that level, but it's on every other level too. It's on 1,001 levels. But I think that's the level that you find first, especially if you've read Ulysses and you know that Joyce was pushing towards more and more realism about biological facts that have been under heavy taboo in English, Irish culture for a long time. I also think excretion and urination play a large role in Finnegan's Wake because Joyce, with all of his elaborations, remained fundamentally a documentary-style artist. And I think Joyce did a lot of studies of the sleeping brain and concluded that all night long, whatever you're dreaming about, one part of your brain is constantly checking whether you have to get up and go to the bathroom or not. I think that's why excretion and urination are so prominent. The brain is constantly checking the bowel and the bladder to see if you got to get up and do something without them being full.
So it was part of the stream of consciousness narrative technique.
Well, it was part of Joyce's documentary approach to literature. There's a great story in Ellman's biography of Joyce. He was the best-known eccentric at University College. He was 18 years old and he had an article published in the most distinguished literary journal in England. Everybody was astounded. But it was even more astounding that this boy genius was an outspoken atheist, an enemy of the church, and a general rebel. And he was regarded as the eccentric of University College by all the other students, the rebel that the other rebels couldn't understand. And one day he came into a class for which he was not an old student, walked through the back of the room over to the window, took out a notepad, and was busy writing. Finally, the Jesuit teacher said, "Mr. Joyce, what are you doing?" And Joyce said, "They're burying an alderman. I'm counting the mourners." Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake are full of that kind of details. When Bloom walks down Grafton Street, Joyce, who was writing in Trieste, wrote to an aunt in Dublin to make sure he got the time right from O'Connell Bridge to Trinity College so that Bloom would not take too long or seem to be running. Behind all the subjective shifting of perspectives, the objective details in Ulysses are astonishingly accurate.
Do we find any conspiracy theory going on in Ulysses?
Well, Joyce used to be considered the most apolitical of artists, but there's been a rebellion against that. I've got 3 books, Manganiello's Joyce's Politics, which argues that Joyce had a strong sympathy for both Benjamin Tucker's individualist anarchism and Leo Tolstoy's anarcho-pacifism. This is based on articles Joyce wrote in Italian when he was living in Trieste, which hadn't been translated before. in which he does express his political opinions rather frankly. Joyce and the Politics of Desire is a feminist defense of Joyce against feminists who claim he was really a misogynist, and what looks like feminist ideas in his books is really a facade behind it. Joyce fears and hates women, and this one argues that's not true at all. He's one of the greatest feminist artists who ever happened to be born with a willy. And then there's Vincent Chang's Joyce, Race and Empire, which sees a steady progression in Joyce from Dubliners to Finnegan's Wake. And it's all about the oppressive effect of British rule on Ireland. In Ulysses, the parallelisms gradually make you see this as part of a general pattern of colonialism all over the world. And in Finnegan's Wake, the multiple language creates a thing where everything refers to the British domination of Ireland. Everything refers to every other act of imperialism in world history. So he starts out satirizing British conquest of Ireland and the racial stereotypes that were created to justify this. But that's hilarious illustrations from English magazines of the 19th century of what the Irish looked like to the English. They looked more like gorillas than human beings in these things. I've seen illustrations where Negroes look like that put out by the Ku Klux Klan. This seems to be a very popular thing with racists, to take whatever group you're going to hate and make them look more like other primates than like human beings. And as Chang points out, this was a literary environment in which Joyce grew up, in which he was classified as subhuman, a sort of gorilla. That's the way the Irish were regarded by the English. So this ties in with that extreme view that Joyce was a one-man literary IRA. But Joyce is parodying English racism. It's more and more generalized still in Finnegan's Wake. He's parodying every type of racism and group prejudice in the world, especially if it has an imperialist motive behind it. Ezra Pound, in one of his reviews, said, in presenting Ireland under English domination, Joyce implicitly shows the entire Occident under the domination of finance capital. That was before Pound coined the word usurocracy, or otherwise he would have said the Western world under the influence of usurocracy. The international bankers were called the finance capitalism.
It's interesting that these two writers, Joyce and Pound, were contemporaneous with each other. What was it about that time in history that seemed to create so many other great artists?
Of course, they were contemporary with D.W. Griffith, who revolutionized film, and with Picasso, who revolutionized painting, and Frank Lloyd Wright, who revolutionized architecture. I suppose I would have to say it was a doubling of information. By 1900, information had doubled for the first in 250 years. There are previously doublings took millenniums. By 1900, when they were all becoming mature, Picasso, Pound, Joyce, Frank Lloyd Wright, they were all either in their 20s or their late teens. The world was obviously so full of new information that it seemed obvious that we needed new kinds of art to express our new apprehension of the new universe we were in. Specifically, Picasso started his Cubist period after seeing Africa in an exhibit put on by the anthropologist Leo Frobenius, who appears frequently in Pound's cantos because he turned Pound on to African poetry, like he turned Picasso on to African painting. And Levi Gould, the anthropologist, is mentioned by name in Finnegan's Wake, and he's also quoting in the canto. So it's Sir James Fraser, another anthropologist. Well, Van Gogh did a few paintings in Chinese style before he developed his later style, which is semi-Chinese. In the late Van Gogh painting, you have two perspectives usually, at least sometimes three, instead of the one perspective of Da Vinci. But before Van Gogh developed that, he did a couple of things in the Chinese style, which was no perspective at all, except up and down. So, I saw them in the Van Gogh Museum. What I'm groping my way to, I suppose, is Andre Malraux's thesis in Museum Without Walls, that the major cause of the mutations in modern art come from anthropology and from, believe it or not, from imperialism. With all the horrors of imperialism, at least it brought back information about people who saw the world in different ways than Western educated people do. And those with the most open and curious minds started experimenting to trying to see the world like the Chinese do or like the Africans do and so on. And that seems to be a large part of the revolution that has occurred in the art of the 20th century.
So in essence, it's a multicultural revolution.
Yeah, well, the cantos, it's the tale of the tribe, as Pound says. Who is the tribe? The tribe seems to include Chinese, Africans, Americans, Europeans, ancient Greeks, Babylonians. The tribe is the first attempt at a global epic.
And do you think in our own time we're getting closer to this?
Yeah, well, I think the internet is bringing us closer and closer to the point where the tale of the tribe will be available to everybody, whether they read Pound or not. I've got on my email list by people in Germany and Taiwan and Australia and England. And I'm looking forward to getting more people from Africa and Asia on my email list. Well, if quotas were Pound again, peace comes with communication. I think the more communication, the better. As Norbert Wiener said, to live effectively is to live with adequate information. To me, the cantos looks more and more like my email. And my email looks more and more like the cantos. It's miscellaneous, assorted. You can't quite find the order, but there is an order. The order is the order of the way human beings relate to the realities around them.
Interestingly, you've written about both Joyce and Pound as, in a sense, prophets of the internet.
Yeah, well, who's generally regarded as the major prophet of the internet? Marshall McLuhan. There are more and more books coming out reinterpreting McLuhan because internet makes a lot of what McLuhan wrote make more sense than it did before internet got as big as it is now. I got a book called Digital McLuhan, which applies his theories to the current state of internet and what we're expected in the next 5 to 10 years. Now, McLuhan always said he got most of his ideas from Joyce. That's no secret. In almost every book he stops off somewhere to mention James Joyce as the major authority on how media affect us. Well, McLuhan also got a lot from Pound. I first encountered McLuhan in the 1950s in various academic magazines writing essays on Pound's cantos. And then Pound and McLuhan together formed Square Dollar Press, which was a typical Poundian idea. There's a lot of books that Pound thought were tremendously important that nobody wanted to publish. So Pound got the idea of publishing highlights from these important books in thin volumes that you could sell for $1. So even if people didn't get to read the whole book, if they read these selections, they might be so inspired they would spend the money to hunt up a rare book dealer to find the books. So McLuhan and Pound put out Fenelos's essay on the Chinese written character, which Pound was always trying to get into print and never could find a publisher to print, and a selection of passages from Agassiz illustrating close observation and accurate description, and Pound's translations of the Chung Yung and the Ta Shil of Confucius, and from Alexander Delmar's History of Monetary Systems, I guess chiefly Pound, but McLuhan was co-editor of the series. They selected the worst atrocities committed by bankers throughout history and published it as a history of monetary crimes. And if Pound had the effect he wanted, then Agassiz would be republished in full, and we'd get Alexander Delmar's History of Monetary Systems in full. But anyway, we got the highlights thanks to the Square Dollar series. So McLuhan was very, very much aware of Pound and Pound's importance. And the technique of the cantos is in many ways closer to internet than Finnegan's Wake is.
Well, both he and Joyce seem to have taken basically all information available to them and kind of condensed and synthesized it into their own vision.
Yeah, Finnegan's Wake and the cantos are so remarkably different on the surface, but underneath, both of them seem to be trying to include as much of humanity as possible in one book.
Well, what's interesting to me is that opportunity is now available to all of us, since we have this giant information source.
That's what I mean about Joyce and Pound being prophets of internet. Reading Joyce and Pound is much easier now that internet exists, because every time you're really puzzled, just put it into your search engine and you'll find out something about it. The internet more and more begins to approximate the minds of Pound and Joyce.
This concludes Session 2. Our program continues with Session 3.